Doughboys in communist Russia. These men, fragments of an Allied task force, fight an undeclared war while the world is technically at peace. A venture that started months before the armistice and stumbles on past the peace at Versailles. A campaign of hazy objectives and conflicting motives. Of battalions isolated from each other and from any recognized front, except the frozen maelstrom of Russia's civil war. The Allied intervention in Russia, that half-forgotten epilogue to the First World War, that prologue to the conflicts of Soviet Russia and the West. Russia in 1918, the enigma closing in on the mystery. The Tsar overthrown, the Bolsheviks in control, under a new name, the Communist Party, in a new capital, Moscow. It is a kind of puppet government, a German official installed in every ministry, German troops spreading through the country. Russia has abandoned the war. Its leader, Lenin, resisting Allied pleas to maintain the Eastern Front to ease the pressure in the West. The communists are playing along with the conquerors, playing for time. Lenin, organizing the new social order of the communist state, while his colleague, Leon Trotsky, organizes the force behind it. Trotsky's mission is to recast the imperial army into a weapon of the revolution. Rebuild, recruit, indoctrinate a Red Army that will ensure the Bolsheviks' grip on the nation, restore Russia as a world power, and then reclaim the German spoils. The Red Army mobilizes. While the Red Army grows, the vast terrain of Russia rumbles with opposition. Dissident groups who refuse to accept the German conquest or the communist regime. A Cossack army ranges up the Don River Valley under a former Tsarist general, Anton Denikin. A Tsarist admiral, Alexander Kolchak, is setting up an opposition regime in Siberia, a harsh military dictatorship with promises of future reform. Another restless force, a curious holdover from the war, is the Czechoslovak Legion, 60,000 strong. Mostly defectors from the German side, they fought for Russia on the Eastern Front and are now heading for the Western Front to resume the fight as Allied soldiers. Their daring adventure will have drastic effects. The Czech mission proves disruptive, a magnetic force attracting opposition groups, anti-German, anti-Bolshevik, all along its curious route. Not west but east along the 3,000-mile Trans-Siberian Railway toward the one sure exit, the port of Vladivostok. Some Czechs reach port. But then Bolsheviks and Germans blocked the route. 40,000 Czechs are stranded. And the Allies have a cause. Rescue the Czechs. A cause for intervention in Russia. American diplomatic quarters in Russia joined the mounting campaign for intervention. To Ambassador David Francis, the Bolshevik government is a foul monster, repressing its people and collaborating with the Germans. To the British and French, who start sending troops to Vladivostok in August 1918, the Bolsheviks are also a roadblock in the way of that goal firmly fixed by British Cabinet Minister Winston Churchill. Above all things, reconstitute the fighting front in the east. Vladivostok, now in the friendly hands of the Czech advance guard. Vladivostok will be a bridgehead. The nearby Asian ally, Japan, joins the intervention with a force of 70,000. Japan, eager to advance its interests in the Far East at the expense of its historic rival, Russia. Japan's entry is enough to galvanize the United States, whose president, Woodrow Wilson, has been sweating blood, as he says, about the moral issue of intervention. Sympathetic with the Czechs, uneasy about the Japanese, Wilson now sends a force of 7,000 Yanks to the rescue. He is thinking about sending a YMCA detachment too, as a moral influence on the Russian people. Rescue mission or bridgehead, or an empire, a second front, or an anti-communist campaign. This wild welter of motives turns Vladivostok into a bedlam headquarters. Americans, British, French, Japanese, joined by Italians and Chinese, by displaced Czechs and dissident Russians. British and French generals will send their forces as far as 3,000 miles west toward Moscow, while the American general, William S. Graves, refuses to budge. He has been warned by Washington. Watch out. You will be walking on eggs loaded with dynamite. For the American troops, some in special uniform to meet the unfamiliar rigors of Siberia, duty will consist mainly of guarding the Trans-Siberian Railroad and the piled-up supplies. 800,000 tons of Allied equipment sent to the Russians while they were still in the war. Equipment now rusting at Vladivostok, at Bloody, as the doughboys call it. Allied aid to a former ally. Besides these vast stores at Vladivostok, there are others 4,000 miles away in North Russia. There, in this eventful summer of 1918, the Allies are staging another intervention. More dynamite, and Americans right in the thick of the explosions. Intervention in North Russia at two remote ports. First Murmansk, then on to Archangel, over Soviet protests. The local reception has been warmed up by a political coup promoted by British agents. A coup replacing the local Soviet authorities with a new group, moderate and friendly. Officially, the Allies are here as protectors to defend North Russia from German forces threatening to take over the area. Defend North Russia and its 160,000 tons of Allied supplies. But the mission quickly takes an expansive turn. A detachment of American sailors on duty with the British helps set the tone with a freelance escapade. Commandeering an old locomotive, they drive 30 miles down the line and get into a shooting scrape with the Bolos, occupation slang for the Bolsheviks. With one man slightly wounded, they ride back to Archangel as the expedition's first heroes. The Allied commander, British General F.C. Poole, has great plans for North Russia. Move out from Archangel, link up with the anti-communists in Siberia, re-establish the Eastern Front. As British regiments strike south through mosquito-ridden forest and marshland, Poole cables London, "I am quite cheerfully taking great risks." It is open warfare between Allies and Communists. On September 4th, 1918, 2 months before the armistice, American infantry arrives in Archangel. 3 battalions with engineers and medics. 5,000 men, mostly recent draftees from Polish neighborhoods of Detroit and Milwaukee, who thought they were headed for the trenches of France, like everybody else. Their first letters home begin, "Guess where I am." One battalion settles into Archangel to take up the duties prescribed by President Wilson. The only legitimate object is to guard military stores. The other 2 battalions are being shipped forward. When the early Arctic winter closes in, they will find themselves scattered 200 miles deep in communist Russia by order of General Poole, with enthusiastic support from American Ambassador Francis. Doughboys manning outposts like nothing on the Western Front, except for the shooting. On November 11th, 1918, Armistice Day on the Western Front, 300 Americans are engaged in battle against a communist attack force. "28 American soldiers die in the Battle of Armistice Day. The risks so cheerfully taken are producing nothing but conflicts and casualties. And with the war ended, there is no longer any reason for an Eastern Front." A strapping young British general, William Edmund Ironside, just 38, is now in charge, replacing Poole and his headlong tactics with a cool and measured policy. Defense. Dig in and wait to be pulled out. Message to the troops from the American consul at Archangel. You men want to know what you are doing here. You are protecting one spot in Russia against the sanguinary bedlam of Bolshevism. don't think you are forgotten. The link between allies and anti-communists, far from abandoned, will now be reinforced by diplomacy and by military aid. With Admiral Kolchak gaining support in Siberia, the anti-communist movement looks promising. In 1919, Kolchak is officially recognized as supreme ruler of Russia by the Allies gathered in Paris for the peace conference. Recognized with some misgivings by Lloyd George and Woodrow Wilson. The Allies are now committed to Kolchak and his cause, the overthrow of the Soviet government. Russia in 1919. Anti-communist armies on the buildup. Kolchak's troops in Siberia. Denikin's Cossacks. North Russians trained by General Ironside. Equipped with French and British arms. American food and supplies. $300 million in British funds. Armies under the white banner. Europe's traditional color of counter-revolution. Russia is a battleground. Red against white. A nation of refugees caught between armies. A war with little valor and no mercy, in Winston Churchill's phrase. These prisoners are communists, captured by white troops. The same fate is shared by prisoners on the other side, in the hands of the Reds. A landscape of starvation, bloodshed, confusion, ruin, and horror. So Lloyd George describes post-war Russia. In the summer of 1919, with the Civil War mounting in fury, the Allies begin a withdrawal, fearful of raising the price they have already paid for intervention in Russia. 200 Americans are among the Allied dead. When the last battalion set sail from Archangel, an American lieutenant writes, not a soldier knew, no, not even vaguely, why he had fought, or why he was going now, or why his comrades were left behind beneath the wooden crosses. Withdrawal from North Russia and Siberia, in spite of Allied spokesmen, led by Winston Churchill, who urged reinforcements to continue the war against Bolshevism. Says Lloyd George, "I would rather leave Russia Bolshevik than see Britain bankrupt." The war against Bolshevism is left in Russian hands. Much of North Russia is under white control. Denikin's Cossacks have advanced on a broad front to within 200 miles of Moscow. And Kolchak, the main standard bearer, now outnumbers the Red Army opposing him in his drive from Siberia. The communists in their capital at Moscow are under pressure from every side. But late in 1919, the Red Army, whipped into battle trim by Trotsky, the Red Army begins a massive campaign to drive out what the communist leaders call the instruments of capitalist imperialism. Crush the white opposition. Savage winter campaign, the Red Army, now 5 million strong, drives Kolchak's forces back to Siberia. Kolchak's White Army disintegrates, troops defecting from his harsh command. Kolchak captured and executed, a pistol at the back of his head. The other white forces are falling back. Troops in mutiny against Tsarist generals, leaders quarreling among themselves. In this war without mercy, the last victims will be the whites, slaughtered in communist reprisals against those who collaborated with the Allies. By mid-1920, intervention and aftermath have ended, an episode that Russia will long resent and the West will long regret. Some because it turned the communists into enemies, others because it not only failed to crush them, but left them strengthened. In the wake of World War I, history has set its ominous course. Russia is red. Next week, the post-war world. New causes, Nazi, fascist, communist. Emerging from one cataclysm, pointing the way to another. Heritage of war. The concluding episode of this series, World War I.